I'm Monica. Nice to meet you. I am recording this webinar. Quite a few people couldn't make this time, and then I also am going to send out a replay. So just an FYI. I would like to make it interactive and engaging. This is an opportunity for you to ask questions and us to have a discussion. So as I go through kind of the main bullet points and my recommendations, it would be great if you could write your questions into the chat box, and I'll go through them as I'm going through the presentation. And then at the end of the webinar, I can cover any college-related questions that you have. So just keep like a list of things that come up, and then I can go through them at the end. So a little bit about me. I have been a college counselor for over 7 years. I started out working with C2 Education in Livingston, and I spent quite a few years with them. So I'm very familiar with this environment of schools in this area because I worked with schools, students from Livingston, Milburn, Short Hills, all over. Since then, I have been consulting with companies on college counseling programs and helping them get them set up. And I've also been working with families here and there, helping them with their applications. This is the first time that I'm doing like a larger kind of outreach for clients because up until now I was doing a lot of consulting, so I didn't have a lot of time. But now I've kind of cleared up my schedule and I'm excited to, meet a lot of families locally and work with them. Before I was a college counselor, I taught business to undergrads, and that's what actually inspired me to do college counseling because I found that students were really interested in knowing about my background and my career. It was helping them make decisions about their career, and it just made sense to me that I should be doing something which was more holistic and helping them with big picture stuff. And then I got into college counseling for that reason. I've worked with hundreds of students. Several have gotten accepted to top 20 colleges in the US. I've created an internship program for companies and placed hundreds of students into internships with nonprofits, startups, corporates, all kinds of opportunities. And I've coached high school students on career skills, networking, mock interviewing, and things like that. Okay, so let's just jump right in. So my goal for you for today is really to save your time and energy. There's a lot of information out there about what's happening in college admissions. And if you have endless amounts of days and weeks to read it, that's great. But most people don't have the time to kind of parse through all that and figure out what is relevant for them. So the presentation today is really for families that are just starting on the process and your teen is a junior. So if your teen's a sophomore, this will be too delayed for you, but this is really to help you at this point in time right now. What should you be doing with your junior? Okay, so let me start with a little bit of background on what colleges look for. So like the top acceptance factors. So I call them the top two and then the other stuff. So the top two factors are GPA and test scores. There is no getting around the cutoff for GPA and test scores. You do have to have these metrics to be considered by schools. It's kind of like if you think about if 1,000 kids apply to a college and the college has, a certain cutoff in mind of what the GPA and the test score should be, they basically only consider the students that fall within that range. So even if you have the best resume and you've basically invented something that changed the world, colleges won't necessarily see that if you don't fall within the range that they're looking for. And the range depends on the college. It depends on what major you're applying into. There's some other factors around this. So it just really depends on the actual school itself. And one question I get a lot is about test optional. So since COVID, many schools were test optional, but since that time, that's really been scaled back. And there's a lot of data out there that shows that test optional is really strongly recommended because students are getting into schools that are submitting tests at a higher rate than those that don't submit their test scores. And it kind of makes sense because it's another data point for colleges to have. And so I highly recommend that if you're considering not doing the test or what is the importance of the test anymore in this environment, it's still very relevant. And many people, students that are submitting the test, are using it as kind of a leverage, and it helps her application. So the top two factors are GPA and test scores. And so students have to have that to be even considered. Now I call the next tier of factors the things that you can actually control beyond academics. And there's three things here. One is your resume. So, the extracurriculars, all the activities you've been doing. The other two are the personal statement and the supplements. And depending on who you talk to, either the personal statement or the supplements can be considered more important for admissions, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. They're equally important, both the personal statement and the supplemental questions. And then so these factors, resume, personal statement, supplements, you have a lot of control over these, obviously. You can really put a lot of effort into these and make a difference. Then there's other factors which you have no control over. There's nothing that you can do about them. So legacy is one. In other words, if a parent went to a college, then the chances are that the student will have a better chance. So that's a big one. And another one is regional bias, meaning that if you're applying to a school in a different part of the country, they probably have a track record or a history. And so they may not admit students from New Jersey just because they have this history of students not applying, not taking spots. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So broadly speaking, those are the top admissions factors. Anybody have any questions about that? If not, I'll just keep moving. You can put them in the chat box as well. Okay, so knowing that, what are like the three key pieces of advice, the three smart moves I say that is very useful for juniors right now. So summer and fall, summer of after junior year and fall of senior year are the most important times for the application in terms of the extracurricular activities. And the reason is because this is the time that students tend to have the most complicated, most responsible opportunities, and they're able to show their leadership in a much more tangible way. And this really doesn't actually happen. I mean, if you're super advanced, some students are definitely able to do that earlier, but most students tend to need that much time during high school to really actually get to that level that they can have confidence in their leadership skills, that they can do things like that. And so those activities tend to happen summer and fall of junior year, and that's what colleges are looking at. So my first piece of advice is that don't waste time on your activities in this time period. And the one thing that you should do is that you should prioritize those activities that are actually going to show your leadership skills, how you actually, what you have learned, what are you passionate about, versus ones that are just kind of like, you've been doing them for a time. And so this is a really controversial statement. I always get a lot of pushback on this. But so like one piece of advice that I give is cut back on activities that aren't really adding any value anymore. You really have precious time. There's a lot of things that need to be done in these few months. So you got to finish up the SAT, ACT. You have to write all these essays. You have to visit schools, ask for recommendations, do this sheets, everything. So you just don't have a lot of time. And if you're spending time on activities, which maybe either you already got the value of, or they're taking a lot of your energy, that's time that you're taking away from things which are actually going to stand out. So highly recommend dropping activities which are just not adding value anymore. Does the holistic approach in college selection always also focus on GPA and test scores? Yeah. So the holistic approach is for all the factors beyond GPA and test scores. So if there was no holistic approach, it would only be GPA and test scores. But when colleges say we take a holistic approach, they're kind of fibbing a little bit. So you do have to get through that first kind of range, and then the holistic comes in with all the other factors. So it's kind of like a hybrid approach. Good question. So that's my first recommendation. Look at your activities list and see what you can drop or you don't need to spend too much time on. Another key thing on activities, I'm going to spend a lot of this. The first smart move about activities is actually quite important. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this. So the second recommendation that I have is don't start anything new unless it's connected to a previous activity. So sometimes students will say, well, I can do this new volunteer thing and get a senior position. Okay, if you've been doing volunteering and that is a part of your high school profile, then continue. But if you haven't done any volunteering, or volunteering is not a good example, but if let's say you haven't done like anything that's business related and all of a sudden you did a business activity in summer, that's not really showing a theme, and it just looks like you're filling up your resume. So it looks fake, honestly. So you don't want to do anything which is going to look inauthentic. Authentic is a word that we're going for. That's what admissions people are looking for. So definitely don't start something that really doesn't fit in with the rest of your resume. Okay, and another recommendation that I have is, so you've kind of gone through your activities list, you've cut out what's not valuable, you've decided that you're not going to start anything new. Then you want to look at what remains and pick out like one or two of your activities and focus on those to take them to the next level over the coming months. And so that could be, maybe there's like, something that you've been doing at home and you want to make it into a research paper. Or maybe there's an organization you've really been involved with, and now you think you can have an event for them or organize an event. So you want to do something in something you've already been doing that now shows that you've kind of like broken from the pack and you're ahead of the curve and you're like planning things for the organization. Something that's an example of one. And then the last piece of recommendation that I have is try to connect most of your summer plans and fall plans to your intended major. So the majors that you're considering, try to make these activities as close to what you want to study as much as possible, because that actually will come up in the application and you want to have a lot of things to say. And then you also want to show that right before you apply to colleges, this is what you were thinking about majoring, and you can't just say it, you have to show it through actions. Any questions at this point? Please put them in the chat. Okay. Yes, I remember Isha. I hope she's doing well. Let me just go through the questions. Yeah. Can you touch upon the help you provide students in getting internships? Sure. I'll do this later in the presentation, because that's somewhat related to a different topic, but I will definitely cover that. Okay, so those are the key the first move is basically reorganizing and reprioritizing your activities list. Now, the second recommendation or smart move that I recommend for juniors, also somewhat controversial, is not to start working on the personal statement first, but it's to prioritize writing supplements. Now, this is really sad because I can't tell you how many times I've had students come to me and they started doing the writing supplements a couple of weeks before the application deadline. And I hate to break the news to them, the writing supplements are more important than the personal statement in terms of them getting accepted into a college. And here's the reason why. Writing supplements, there's basically two questions. One is, what do you want to study? That's all about majors, all your intended majors and your activities. And then the second question is, why do you want to come to this school? So colleges are using those two pieces of information to make kind of the biggest decisions, which is this student qualified enough for the major that they're thinking of? So they're looking through that answer very carefully to understand, are you faking it? Do you generally have an interest in this major? Do you have the skill set? And that will affect, and we all know that I know this, you may know this, what you choose to major in is actually one of the biggest determinants of whether you get into a school. So they're looking at that very closely. And then why us? Because they know that students are applying to upwards of 20 schools. No one that's working with me is applying upwards of 20 schools. I don't recommend over 12 to 15, but students are doing that because it's very confusing. They don't understand where they'll get in. So rather than take a risk, they're just applying to a lot of schools. And then what happens is that, let's say they get into 20 schools. They're obviously not going to go to 20 schools. So colleges will Basically be annoyed in a way if you don't take a spot, and it actually affects their rankings, which is it's a very business decision as well. If their rankings go down, we all know that that's like the worst thing for them. So they're very carefully thinking about, one, are you a good fit for the major that you are thinking about? And then two, what are you actually going to go to the school? So I always give the example of University of Texas, UT Austin, which is very popular with the tech majors. You can apply there, but most probably you're not going to get in, even if you think that your qualifications are right, because in the past, students got in and they did not go there. So, just for that reason that you have no control over, you may not get into that school. So, all this happens in the writing supplements. And so when I meet with students, I actually have them start on the writing stuff, like brainstorming them out immediately. And the reason is because it actually takes time. So even though they say, okay, I want to study, computer science, okay, but why? Like, what happened for you to get excited about this and interested in this? And it's like a blank stare. Oh, because like, I heard someone said it's a great industry because my parents did it, everyone else is doing it. Okay, but none of that is going to get you into the school because none of it is convincing. So the supplements are super important. And so my second recommendation is, rather than jumping on the personal statement, relax on that. You can start thinking about it, but jump in on the writing supplements because they're that important to the application process. And then my third recommendation is really connected to that, which is you have to visit colleges. I don't know why students think that they can just apply to schools and they'll think about it later. I give the example of BU and NYU. BU and NYU are two schools that most students will get excited about and put them on their college list. The minute that they set foot on those campuses, they're immediately saying, no, I don't want to be here, because those campuses aren't really campuses. They're kind of urban, spread out. So you don't get that like college town feel. And so it's really important to visit colleges for the list. And then if you go visit a college, especially the ones that you're really interested in, now you have information to put in the supplements. If you write a supplement with no reference to the school that's specific that you couldn't have figured out from the website, that's an immediate red flag to schools. And I've noticed that if students haven't visited schools, I have actually noticed a connection between how convincing they are in terms of like, do they like the school? Are they going to go there? And so if it is a school that your teens really interested in, they should set foot on campus as they're writing the supplements. In fact, it will help them to strengthen the supplements better. And the college list is definitely something. You don't have to go to every school, but if you go to like a broad section of three types of schools, so like a large one, a smaller one, maybe something in the rural area, then students get a real clear sense of, and it really helps the college list come together in a much more formal way. Okay, so just to recap, admissions factors, there's some that you have no control over. GPA and test scores at this point, that's pretty much set. And then if you want to hear more about how many tests to take, I actually have an article on my website which talks about this in terms of how many tries is good. Yeah, and so that's that. So any other questions? Neeraj, I'll go through your question about internships. So I worked with an organization based out of Seattle, and I set up a program for them. And the entire program was meant to coach and get students to a level that they could have interviews and that they could do basically work with an organization on very quality projects. So we placed hundreds of students, and they worked with nonprofits, they worked with startups in the area. This was all in the Seattle area. And they worked with, even like some of them ended up coming together and starting their own companies and like making little internships. So it really depends on what the student was majoring in, based on what they were interested in. That's like how I got them placed. There aren't really formal. So the thing about internships for high school students is that the formal programs for internships are actually pretty not that interesting. So what happens is that they will bring in a batch of students, and then they we'll give them little lame projects. Like they won't really do anything. They basically are just to say that the company has an internship program. But when I was working with students, I figured out a way to present them to the company that, basically taking their skill set, that they were getting projects. So they were getting really high value projects in terms of, I mean, as high as I can go for a high school student. I mean, the business wasn't being handed over to them, but essentially, like they were getting really high quality experience. And I found that if that's something that you're really interested in, the best place to get internships for high school students is actually smaller companies for that reason. These kids are smart. They have resumes which are completely ridiculous. And so they sometimes I almost feel like they're on par with sometimes with college students in terms of their skill set. And so the training that I've done with them is more around polishing them, getting them up to, networking level of like polish and how do you speak and mock interviews and sending emails. And you'll be surprised when you actually send a resume, which is presented in the right way. I actually go through this in the sessions as well. It really highlights how much experience these kids have over the years. And that was overwhelmingly the response was if I had known that these kids were doing these kinds of projects on their own or for school, then I would have set up a program like this earlier. So that's a little bit about the internship program.